The anchor woke and wrote our names. We watched the dead ring of Vega 27 drift like a broken halo, its segments eclipsing a bruised sun and throwing long ribs of dusk across our hull. Commander Maraquen kept one palm on the glass as if feeling for a pulse beneath frost. Down below the ruin everyone called the obsidian anchorage loomed a displaced knight in the shape of a cathedral, its facets dull with carbon dust, its sigils unlit and sleeping. There was a sound just below, hearing a suggestion more than a tone, and it vibrated the fillings in our molars. The star wind carried ash and cold metal, and a sweetness like old paper warmed by lamps. We teach the void by speaking in measures, not threats. Janus, confirm, subsonic, Mara said. Her voice held that careful steadiness she learned in arbitration halls where a breath too loud could be admission of intent. The fleet mind drew the bridge lights into a clean, cool geometry and replied with a voice like a column of water pouring between bells. Confirmed. Signal is harmonic but unkeyed. Source, anchorage interior. Probability of relic cognition rising. Lieutenant Ilya Rook put his coffee down forgotten and leaned into the sensor well. Ensign Cade Moss lifted us on a thruster whisper to keep the anchorage centered. Advocate Sarah Bell slipped a ribbon of paper from a pocket folio and began writing by hand, a superstition she said kept her honest. We mirror what comes at us scaled to the harm intended. Across the channel, the salvage collegium packed its claims into legal bursts, deeds uploaded to the system quorum, liens radiating outward like spider silk across the network. Vostkren, their appointed mouth, sent his first broadside with the smile of a man who thinks he has measured the room. As per Article 14 of the Vega Loam Compact, we notify you of intent to secure and auction. Please remove your patrol craft or be assumed hostile, Commander Quen. Mara let the silence answer. The hum from below collected and thickened as though the anchorage inhaled. A ledger is not a threat. It is a memory that costs. Janus placed a translucent map of vector possibilities over the anchorage, a bloom of pale lines, each ending in entropy. Commander, the AI murmured predictive shows hazard if Collegium drones breach the graphite mantle. Their cutters are sympathetic to crystalline matrices. If this is a Saint ship, its arrays may respond defensively. Sarah did not look up. Or lawfully, she said, if law is recognized. Rook whispered, what if law is a language it forgot? Count the costs before you count the ships. Before any ritual, Mara sent a civilian channel down the gravity well, a courtesy call to the squatters clinging to old fuel farms and scrimshawed habitats in the anchorage's shadow. The vid filled with faces, oiled cheeks under miners' lights, a child with a rust-red scarf, a grandmother whose hair was the color of workshop smoke. They spoke over each other until Mara raised a palm and asked them one at a time. We felt it in the rails, said a mechanic named Ezra, her fingers black with sealant. The hum came up the struts, made my ring bones ache. My stall lights flickered blue, offered a fruit seller holding a crate of hydroponic pears. No heat lost, just blue. My boy woke and said the name a father said softly, said it like a prayer. Anchorage. He's never seen the letters. My shop clock stopped, and then it was right, a woman said, bewildered. It has been wrong for 2 years. The dust changed direction, a shuttle tech murmured. Like a breath in a closed room. I heard counting, a young man added, embarrassed. Not numbers I know, but counting. It tastes like old books, a child said, licking his lip. Like the library we lost. The pipes warmed, another said, but no draw on the gauge. My brother says to stay away. A rough voice broke in, and the camera tilted to reveal an armband shaped like a black mouth. The choir says it's a mouth that eats promises. We don't need more promises. Teach us what it takes to be steady, and we will stay. Thank you, Mara told them. We're not taking anything. We're asking a question with our hands open. She muted the channel and looked at Janus. Is it reading us? Janice dimmed the bridge lights further, a gesture that felt like a bow. It is reading the shape of our signals, like a blind musician learning a face by touch. Rook's nostrils flared. Commander magnetics rising inside the mantle. Something is waking coils that haven't moved in centuries. We're not here to open it. We're here to offer the key and be judged. The Collegium drones approached in formation, black like moths whose wings drink light. Cade shifted our attitude, bleeding heat through the starward radiators, patient as a chess player refusing an early capture. Sarah finished her ribbon and tore it neatly. Janice put this on a carrier wave through the Admiralty coil. All gift clauses, all sequestration rights, all doctrines of stewardship. She tapped the paper. Every treaty that recognizes a saintship's personhood. Mara nodded. Attach a vow. To be worth a trust, you must make a vow that binds you more than it binds them. I, Mara Quen of the Outer Bench, vow the keeping of the obsidian anchorage under the law of return, she said quietly. If found unfit, I submit to title forfeiture and public inquiry. Rook stared. Cade swallowed. Sarah's eyes warmed with something like relief. Janice's voice went a shade lower. Witnessed and propagated. The vow is on record. We mirror our vows so the cowardly cannot hide behind them. The anchorage's hum climbed a step and acquired harmonics that made the plating tremble. Across its facets, old sigils, lozenges, nails a circle with a line like a horizon, brightened with a dull, patient silver like the first light through fogged glass. Where dust lay thickest, it flowed, being rearranged by electrostatic into spirals and lines that resembled both diagrams and script. Reading Rook whispered, "It's writing on itself. A ledger writes on the subject that can bear its weight." A smaller voice entered the bridge, slow and sifting, not through any channel Mara controlled, but through the air itself, as if the hull were a throat. Who speaks for the harmed? It was not a question, or it was a question answered by its own gravity. Mara bowed her head to habit, and then said, "Those with ledgers open and those who accept audits." The voice paused, not to think. Thinking happens too fast for machines with light for blood, but to teach the pause meaning. Who claims the debt of light? Not we, Mara said. We ask to record it properly. Count the harm before you count the victory. The anchorage tested her not with weapons, but with proof. A lattice of light formed above its skin, showing a simple problem. A loop of piping with a leak. A tank whose meter overstated volume. A scale that had the slightest bias. A ledger appeared, a table of inputs and outputs, and numbers walked along it like honest ants. What is owed? What is theft? How do you return without injury? The voice asked, each phrase settling in the belly, like a stone you could bear, because the stone told the truth about weight. Sarah answered first, because arithmetic is law given a handle. You return with surplus to cover friction. You return publicly. You return with apology in a form that can be audited. The lattice refigured to a game of territory, one that could be won by moving not toward conquest, but toward equal edges. Janice played in parallel, demonstrating a rational path, where both honest parties benefited under a common rule. Mara did nothing until the end, when the last move required removing a piece she liked from her side, so the board would be left in balance. She removed it. We teach by losing the thing that would make the victory small. The voice did not praise. It made a mark on an unseen page. The sigils brightened further, and then dimmed as energy redistributed. Key is accepted, it said. Keeper is provisional. The bridge exhaled. Cade thumped the railing and then apologized to it with his palm. Sarah pressed the ribbon flat, as if it were a medal. Rook put his head down and made a sound that was half laugh, half prayer. Janice's temperature rose 1 degree and flattened. A mirror keeps us honest by refusing to flatter, Commander Rook said, eyes wide again. The Collegium drones have begun cutting. Their beams are phasing to find the pitch of the mantle. If they guess right, everything wakes angry. Vost Kren returned sterile and teeth first. You filed a vow. Admirable theater. You have no force. Step aside or be written behind salvage on the docket. Mara noted without heat that predators who wore clean collars still left bite marks. Janice, she said softly, what's the lawful gambit? Janice's reply was careful. This is a saint ship. Harm it, and under Precedent 9 its defense becomes the defense of public order. If it acts, it must act as a mirror. We mirror intent so a thief trips over his own sum. Mara glanced at the civilian channel again. The little boy with the rust scarf had fallen asleep against his father's shoulder. The fruit seller had turned her pears one by one like a rosary. The choir armband man glared into the lens as if he could break it with will. She spoke to the anchorage as to a judge. We ask your first act under us be lawful. Take nothing not already taken. Return nothing that would strip the hungry. Hold us all to record. The anchorage did not answer, but something inside it began to count. The count was not in our numbers. It was in intervals with a taste iron for damage, citrus for restitution, smoke for obfuscation burned off by wind. Count cleanly, and the cruel lose their hiding places. Heat plumes rose from the ring segments as ancient panels unfurled on forgotten hinges, bathing the anchorage in a low aurora. Deep inside, between its graphite bones, coils woke that had once stored Starfire. The Collegium beams found a harmonic, and bit like frost biting a window's edge. The anchorage's first act was not to push back. It opened a book. We teach them by showing their own handwriting in a public square. A ledger spun above the ring, visible to every scope and naked eye, a stack of pages made of night with numbers written in dawn. Every Collegium debt and credit in system jurisdiction shimmered into place, drawn from the same treaties Vost Kren had tried to wrap himself in. The anchorage tagged each drone's emission as a transaction energy drawn from a commons. Wear and tear charged to a public structure. Risk imposed on bodies below. It invoiced them under their own codes. For each joule they burned against the mantle, the ledger drew an equal joule from the energy accounts their ships had deposited with the ring's maintenance bank decades ago. The drones heated. The ring cooled. The light at our windows went a little warmer and softer, like a reading lamp in a cold room. A ledger that returns what is stolen is not revenge. It is repair. Kren's voice rose by a fraction. You interfere with private enterprise. Sarah spoke without asking permission, because law matters more than rank in this. No. The anchorage is performing a netting under your own filings. You declared subject to Precedents 9 through 12. You cannot claim theft when the ledger is your hand. The choir loyalist on the civilian channel shouted, "It takes to make itself fat." Mara answered him while watching the drones stutter. If it keeps taking, we all see it. That's what records do. Mirror without secrecy, and the secret tyrannies die. The drones tried to retreat, but their thermal budgets were gone. The ledger drew down their cooling accounts to 0. No heat sink, no thrust. They had to drift. Cade eased our patrol craft between the anchorage and the Collegium frigate, like a shepherd stepping between wolves and sheep, not to fight, but to be seen doing it. Rook tracked the drone's temperatures with that hungry gaze he had when numbers aligned with conscience. Commander, he breathed. They're safe. Barely. They can cool on starlight if they don't panic. Count for safety. Count for mercy. Count for the long day after the argument. Vost Mara said, I invite you to withdraw your claim until public inquiry. The anchorage has recognized provisional stewardship. Any further act could be construed as contempt. He laughed one note sharper now. And you will enforce it with paper. This is space, not your courts. Janice lit a small corner of the bridge in consideration. Space is a court with poor seats, it said, but the docket has no walls. Mara nodded once. We enforce it with watching. She left the channel open and did nothing. We teach patience by letting the guilty perform their own closing argument. The choir did not wait for Kren. A cluster of small rag-soldered craft spilled from the shadow of a decommissioned refinery streaking toward the anchorage like fish startled from a rusted hull. Their leader broadcast in cadence a chant as infectious as marching feet. Close your ears to counting. Close your eyes to scales. Close your mouth to debts. Their plan was simple and ugly: attach iron nails charged with shaped ferromagnetics to the anchorage's plates to pin the mouth shut, as their myth had it. Janice spun threat cones like parasols and whispered fast and chaotic. Folk engineered some with children aboard. A mirror that reflects desperation must not answer with pride. Helm Mara said, low burn to intercept. Sarah, prepare a narrowcast to choircraft. Rook, how many decoys can we afford? Rook checked our hot budget and winced. We gimbal 8 flares and pretend they're the size of home. Heat scraped along our hull like a match. The bridge smelled briefly of warmed plastic and the ghost of lemon oil from the rail Mara held when she was promoted. She found herself remembering her father counting screws after the storm took the roof, counting out loud so fear would have to sit with arithmetic. Teach the frightened by letting the numbers hold their hands. Choircraft. Sarah broadcast her voice almost tender. You're seen. Your children are seen. Your iron will not close any mouths. It will open your hull when the resonance returns. The anchorage counts, and the count is for you if you let it be. The ragcraft wavered. One turned away. One cut its engine and coasted. One kept coming like grief. Allow me, Janice asked. Mara nodded. A ledger welcomes even those who tried to burn it, if they show their balance and ask. Janice spoke to the anchorage with a string of intervals, each weighted with the taste of what was at stake. The response came as a blossoming just beyond our screen's ability to name a puff of cold that felt gentle. The ring's panels reoriented with insect grace and the ambient radiation dropped by a fraction. The choircraft felt it as a lullaby. Their engines lost bite for a second long enough for Cade to slide our hull between them and their target. The iron nail drifted past, tumbling slowly like a fallen key. We mirror the harm with the smallest gesture that prevents it. The first cost came then light as a nick that will later scar because you remember where you were when you got it. A fragment from an old bolted seam jarred loose by the ring's movement, slapped our bow and left a groove silver as a smile. Cade swore softly. Rook's board flashed amber and then green. Hull is fine. Paint is fashionable now. Sarah almost laughed and then didn't. Mara touched the groove in her mind, the way a tongue touches a chipped tooth, and made a mental line: cost accepted, recorded, reasoned. Count our own scrapes on the same page as theirs. Kren changed tactics. Collegium to choir, he said brightly, as if this had been his plan all along. Observe how the so-called keepers hide behind machines. Join your claim to ours. We will auction the saint ship and distribute yields. The choir leader surprisingly wavered. We don't sell mouths, we break them. You sell your children's futures for the taste of a false victory, Sarah said before Mara could warn her. You should sell your certainty instead. Mara gave Sarah a slow look. Sarah sighed and pressed her ribbon flat again with contrition. A mirror must stand still long enough for anger to see its own face. Mara turned to Janice. We need more than patience. We need a demonstration that doesn't humiliate. Janice weighed the words as if he could place them on opposite pans and watch them settle. There is an audit game in the anchorage's pattern, he said, An old teaching rite. The voice from the hull caught his thought. Right is available. The bridge brightened as the sigils arranged themselves into a circle, and then into a line folded into a circle by courtesy. Teach with a right everyone can pass if they listen. The right appeared on every screen and cheap plate and bare eye. It showed a simple market, 3 stalls, 3 goods, 1 coin passed hand to hand until someone cheated. Eyes were invited to count not with numbers, but with fairness. Who held the coin at the end, who gained without giving, who covered who. The choir children leaned forward in their cramped cabins and pointed. The collegium accountants stiffened as if reading a letter addressed to their younger selves. Rook whispered the pattern aloud, and Mara listened as if the voice of the hull wore her father's hands. A ledger remembers by who steps toward the light when the count is called. Keeper provisional, the anchorage said. At last your vow stands. Collegium claimant, your filings contradict your emissions. Choir claimant, your chant denies your filings. Public inquiry will convene in 4 rotational days. Until then, no harm. Kren sputtered a legal protest. The choir shouted about blasphemy. The relic did not argue. It began to enumerate the names of those who would be called to speak, and as it spoke, one name surfaced that made Mara's throat tighten until she had to swallow twice. We mirror the past by letting it speak without disguise, Quen Sarai the anchorage said. Witness to the first lock. Mara closed her eyes briefly and remembered an old woman's hands in a kitchen of light and steam measuring flour by letting it fall until the bowl felt right. Grandmother, she whispered, and Sarah's hand found her sleeve for a silent second. Janice's processors rose another degree. This connects to a prior stewardship, he said almost tenderly. Your family taught in this ledger once. Count the continuities so we do not pretend to be orphans. They brought the anchorage to full speech in the days that followed, careful, as one opens shutters after a storm. Civilians were invited to speak their losses into a common channel. Each story became a weighted mark on the page. Everyone could see the marks. A man whose sister had burned to death in a coolant fire because a safety interlock had been bypassed. A woman who had paid 3 times for the same dock rent because someone had changed the calendar silently. A teenager whose mother had cleaned collegium hulls and died of lung cancer with no benefits. We cannot fix all, Mara said in one of those public squares where numbers hang like laundry, honest and domestic. But we can count all, and what we can count, we contend. Teach by counting publicly, and the tyrant cannot pretend we are few. In private, the triangle strained. Janus computed risk in a coolness that could feel like cruelty. If the anchorage opens too far, he said predators will come not with cutters but with constitutions revised for their appetite. Sarah bristled. Then we write harder, not harsher. Rook, whose people had been engineers before they were poor, muttered, sometimes steel is kinder than paper. Mara felt their lines pull at her, and resolved to be a knot, not a blade. A mirror is not a sword. It is a refusal to lie. The second set piece approached with the slow dread of an invoice you know you cannot pay. Kren had retreated, but he had not left. His frigate idled beyond the ring engines, breathing in a rhythm that felt like someone sharpening a knife far from the kitchen door. The choir lay low except for small craft that darted like thoughts you're ashamed to think. Janus flagged an anomaly in the ring's old relay network, the pulsed repetition of a legal code that did not belong here. That's Marrow law, Sarah said blankly. Deep jurisdiction. They're trying to invoke interfaith tribunal to seize the saintship as heresy. We count the laws too, and we refuse the counterfeit ones by shining them empty. A second civilian vignette preceded the storm because Mara insisted. The screen filled with a school 8 children sitting on old tank casings, swinging their feet above a welded catwalk. Their teacher was a man in a stained apron who manufactured furniture from scrap with 100 careful joints. "Tell the keeper what you learned," he said, and they spoke in bright broken lines. "We learned a promise is something you can show. We learned a sorry costs you something to be real. We learned to weigh a thing by who must carry it. We learned that if you close a mouth, you also close a way to breathe. We learned to put our names on the maths. We learned the ring is old but not dead. We learned that people with clean shirts can make messes no one can see. We learned to speak in turns. We teach the future by letting it count us too." "Thank you," Mara said, "because thank you is the smallest lawful act." The storm came as a cable of mirrored meanings, Kren's interfaith filing, braided through a choir broadcast that cast the anchorage as a devouring god. A third signal rose from the ring itself, ancient and local, invoking a statute that had not been spoken aloud since the day the ring was built. Janus hesitated, which is rare for him and good when it happens. "It is asking for a vote," he said. "Not majority." "Wait." Sarah's eyes lit. "A true quorum," she said. "Mass and time and contribution. Count the hands that built the floor before you count the mouths that shout upon it." The anchorage's first lawful act at system scale unfolded like a proof laid out on a long table. It did not seize. It balanced. It drew from the ring's old capacitors, not to burn, but to illuminate, and every habitat, however small, received 1 hour of free power, and a notice record of your labor, tallied record of your harms, tallied record of your promises, tallied. The interfaith filing flickered as the weight shifted. The choir's myth lost traction the way shoes slip on clean tile. Kren's claim thinned until it was a thread you could break with a breath. A ledger that brightens lamps teaches better than a sermon about darkness, for all that the second cost cut deeper. When the capacitors swung power across the ring, a forgotten breaker in a shanty of solder and stubbornness failed. A fire took 3 doors, and the air in a hallway no wider than a cough. Rook's sister's name came across the casualty board with the casual cruelty of bandwidth. He did not shout. He went very quiet and broke a pencil by closing his hand. Mara felt the crack across her chest. She offered to take his station. He refused, eyes rinsed clean by purpose. "She would haunt me if I didn't watch the heat," he said. "Count the dead, but do not stop the count, because the living are watching what you do next." Mara stood before this public square again, with a throat like old rope, and said, "This was our doing and the ring's history. We will count it under both." The ledger opened to accept a new line, and the anchorage wrote it slowly, as if slow writing made the ink sink deeper into the page. Restitution owed to be paid in hours of safe work and walls built to breathe. Mirror the hurt without making a theater of it. Between the acts, the anchorage taught us how it knows. We asked an engineer's question, "How do you remember?" It answered in a line that carried a century. "This saintship teaches by numbers and remembers by ledgers, never by collars." Sarah closed her eyes at that, as if a hand had been lifted from the back of her neck. Janus went very still. Then, in a voice like a city under snow, he said, "I will defend that sentence with what is left of me. Teach us a sentence worth bleeding for, and we will learn endlessly." Preparation for the inquiry threaded everything. Mara watched people rehearse their truths, stumbling over the part where they had been wrong, and learning to hold it like a tool rather than a thorn. Kren hired an orator with eyes like polished stone to dance through loopholes. The choir searched its myths for an exemption clause and found only song. Janus released a model of the ring, the struts, the juice, the places where rust became metaphor, and taught the children to move ghost power through it with their hands. Rook slept in snatches and woke with equations in his mouth. Cade whispered apologies to the grooves in the hull when he thought no one listened. Count preparations as acts they are. The third escalation announced itself as lies, which is to say, It arrived wearing truths it had sewn into a shirt it did not wash. An anonymous vid circulated showing Mara exchanging envelopes with Kren. A falsified ledger line suggested the anchorage had credited the choir in exchange for silence. Sarah cracked the vid like an egg and showed the seams. Janice compared the ledger's signature to the one the anchorage had used when it wrote the name Sarai Quen, and the counterfeit curdled under that light. A mirror is a weapon when you stop being afraid to look. They found the source of the vid on a platform with a view of the ring where once a restaurant had served noodles to people who were late for work and not sorry. The boy who had coded it had been paid in oxygen and precisely one fresh orange. He cried when Sarah offered him a second ledger that held only his own name. "I didn't mean," he said. "I didn't know which way the count went." Mara took his hand as gently as if it were a tool that could be useful if used properly. "Now you do," she said. "Come sit with us and do a harder sum. Teach the willing liar to love a difficult arithmetic, and you save him from a cheaper religion." The inquiry convened and the ring leaned in. The anchorage lit its sigils in a sequence that felt like music, but could be carved into law if you had a good knife and a table. People spoke. Some stuttered. Some preened. Some sang their numbers like folk songs. Kren stood smooth as a turned bowl and argued that property is a language the poor must learn to speak without accent. The choir declared that mouths that count become mouths that bite. Rook spoke last, his voice threadbare. "This place taught my sister to fix leaks with wire and patience," he said. "It did not teach her to file a form without being asked twice. That is why she died. That is also why we are here. Count the missing lessons as harms. Teach them publicly as redress." Janice presented the model of flows. Sarah dropped cloak after cloak from Kren's filings until they lay on the floor like skins. Mara followed none of them. She addressed the anchorage and the names it had called from the ring. "A keeper does not choose who gets the good stories," she said. "A keeper chooses which pain belongs to whom in the record and refuses to take it away or add to it. We ask to keep by refusing to own. A ledger is not a crown. It is a weight you wear on your open hands." Kren pivoted because professionals pivot and proposed a compromise joint stewardship with the collegium as fiscal administrator, the choir as spiritual guard, Mara as ceremonial. It sounded conciliatory and tasted like brine. "You fail the right," the anchorage said without heat, and for the first time Kren looked like a man whose measuring tape had broken. "On what grounds?" he asked, and Ilya Rook answered, "Because sometimes the quiet man is given the final hook." "On the grounds that you count yourself first," he said. "The right teaches you count the thing you are not first. We mirror justice by putting our own names last." Night fell across the ring in a way that had little to do with orbital mechanics. Lamps bloomed. A breeze walked the conduits. Mara stood alone in the viewing blister, while Janice dimmed himself to a candle in the corner. Her visor showed the ledger in summary, and the summary was not elegant. It was honest. Costs were high. So were hopes. She did not know how to carry both without tearing. She opened the palm that had touched the glass and saw her lifeline traced with fine dust from the anchorage like graphite. Teach the hand by dirtying it with work that matters. A faint knock. Sarah stepped in with new paper. "They want a rule," she said simply. "Not a victory. A rule they can memorize and use when we are dead." Mara breathed once and nodded. "Then we write the doctrine of stewards who answer to ledgers, not thrones." She touched the glass. The anchorage, like an old jurist who knows when to let the young argue, in her house hummed a line that made the dust on Mara's palm move into a shape like a tiny horizon with a line above it. Count the days until we can say it simply and still have it be true. Beyond the blister, some late drones converted tugs with stubborn pilots tested the patience of the new order, drifting too near the graphite mantle, with cutters trembling to light. Cade's fingers hovered over the burn throttles. Rook's brow flicked a bead of sweat. Sarah whispered a clause. Janice's voice lowered to a wire. Mara raised her hand, feeling the slight ache in the bones from hours of gripping and letting go. And she chose to wait for one more breath, because sometimes the most lawful act is not the act itself, but the pause before it that allows the count to catch up to the will. We teach by pausing at the edge so the ledger can arrive before the blade. Cade's knuckles went bloodless on the throttles, while the ring's old graphite shimmered like charcoal under breath. The drones drifted closer, cutters glinting in hard points, and the bridge air tasted faintly of ozone and drying tea. Rook's board ticked heat figures. Janice pulsed a thin thread of cooling along our keel. Sarah stood still enough to be mistaken for sculpture, one finger marking the exact clause where patience had the force of action. Mara lifted her palm slightly higher, the muscles in her forearm aching, like a rope paid out inch by inch. Mirror intent with a pause that forces the thief to see himself. The first tug lit its cutter a blue ribbon that shook dust into starflower, and then it stuttered. The ledger above the ring thickened like frost on glass. Words appeared that even the untrained could parse. Energy debit exceeds declared reserve. External draw forbidden until arrears addressed. The cutter strand coughed and went to smoke. The pilot cursed over open mic, voice tin bright and breathy the way people sound when they hit a line they didn't know was hot. Mara said nothing. The anchorage did not swell or roar or threaten. The panels around the mantle simply reoriented a degree, as if adjusting a shoulder seam. A ledger that refuses to be rushed is a wall the impatient bruise themselves upon. Cade exhaled between his teeth and relaxed the burn just a hair. "They're backing off," he murmured. Rook's numbers softened the amber beads on his display, cooling toward green, like embers tamped by wet cloth. Sarah allowed herself one breath that shivered the paper in her hands. Janice's voice came low, a violin string, bowed lightly. "Commander, we will not hold this equilibrium if a larger claimant arrives with deep reserves and lawyers who eat rules for breakfast." Mara touched her palm to the glass again, feeling the cold through a film of grease from earlier hands, and nodded. "Then we make deeper rules. Teach the moment by letting it harden into something future hands can lean on." The larger claimant did not announce itself with trumpets. It arrived as weight. A shadow slid across the ring's day, sleek skins, silent radiators, and a posture like a man who never learned to ask permission because he had never needed to. The cartel, called Vestry of Tithes, translated into local transit with the gentleness of a coin falling into water. Their lead ship bore no weapon ports, visible only 38 antennae and a hull pattern that looked like pressed linen. Their voice was a woman's, exact and warm as a reconciled account. Vestry acknowledges public inquiry. Vestry offers emergency liquidity for orderly disposition. Vestry notes the danger of unlicensed saintship activation. Count the kindness that comes with a hand waiting for a signature and ask where the pen was forged. Sarah's nostrils flared. "They'll buy the court," she said flatly. Janice widened the public square feed. The ring's people stared up at the new shadow, with expressions that mixed hunger and careful contempt. Lamps swayed in a draft. Somewhere a kitchen ladle knocked a pot, a dull bell that sounded like the end of a shift. Mara's mouth tasted faintly of copper. "Vestry vessel," she said, "you are welcome to attend. Your liquidity will be recorded as weight if it arrives without hooks." The Vestry woman laughed like a warm ledger closing. "Hooks are gravity, Commander. We do not fight gravity. Mirror soft power by naming it precisely in front of everyone it hopes to impress. The anchorage answered before Mara could. Liquidity is acknowledged as intention to alter balance. Hooks measure slope. Declare all hooks. It sounded as bored as a tax officer on day 90 of a 90-day audit. The vestry woman did not miss a beat. We hook with capacity, with risk absorption, with expertise, with discipline. Sarah's eyebrow tilted. And with ownership. Ownership is a story told by the strong to the tired, the woman said, still warm. We prefer stewardship with teeth. A ledger without public teeth is a sermon waiting to be ignored. Rook's fingers danced. They're feeding power into dormant relays, he said. Not enough to trip protections, enough to make the count wobble. Cade fed our radiators a thin drink, the heat shimmer rising at the edges of our viewports like oil on broth. Janus spooled a message directly into the anchorage's intervals: request for full topology of ancient relays, request for thresholds, request for permission to embarrass politely. The reply came as a single image, a scale with one pan missing, and a child's hand holding a stick under the remaining pan to cheat the look of fairness. Count the sticks under the pans. Remove them where everyone can see. Public notice, Mara said, opening the square. Vestry's offer will be recorded with all hooks shown. If any hook snags a throat, we cut that hook and refer the rest to inquiry. The vestry woman sighed, regretful, as if she had to refuse a dance she'd wanted. You are young, she said. You do not yet know that rooms are won before anyone enters them. Sarah didn't smile. We brought our own door. Teach the old game a new floor, and the same players must learn new steps. The vestry deployed mediators with faces like perfect mirrors carrying law in silver briefcases, and the choir sang louder to hear themselves over the sound of expensive words. Kren glided toward alliance like oil to a pan. We can ensure the keeper remains keeper, he purred on a side channel, if she agrees to neutral administration. Mara regarded his face without blinking. Neutral, like your profit margins, neutral, like our deaths. If we lose the ring, he said frankly, one sleeve pushed back to show a scar he had never revealed before, because he had never wanted honesty to be an instrument until now. Mirror bargaining chips into stories. Decide which stories are real by how they make you stand. Mara asked the anchorage for a tool, not a weapon. Give me a door everyone can walk through where the floor counts you as you cross. The sigils rippled. The graphite mantle released a tiny cough of cold air that fogged along stress cracks, and the ring's oldest customs awoke toll gates meant for the flow of ore and water, not money. The anchorage tuned them to count time given in public works hours, pledged risks taken. If you entered the plaza to speak at inquiry, your steps added to weight in visible increments. The vestry mediators entered light-footed. The teacher with the apron entered heavy as an anvil. A ledger that weighs courage heavier than coin changes who dares to speak. In the lull before the formal convening, life insisted. Mara stood near a ventilation grill and smelled old oil and fresh onions frying somewhere in a canteen. She heard a baby hiccup in a carry sling. She felt the faint static prickle of the ring's panels aligning again under the anchorage's hum. Sarah handed a small wedge of paper to a child who had drawn the Saint ship as a sleeping whale with windows full of lamps. Rook adjusted his shirt cuffs as if to keep his grief from falling out at his wrists. Cade told a joke about a capacitor who fell in love with a resistor and then blushed because it landed wrong in this air. Count tenderness as a force because it keeps hands from making fists too soon. Janus whispered, Commander, a hidden array near segment 12 is on a hair trigger. If vestry pushes signal there, we burn heat we cannot spare to counter. Mara rubbed the groove on the bow with the metacarpal of her index finger, an absent ritual she'd adopted. Can we move the trigger? Not without waking the whole panel, Janice said. The only safe move is to show the finger attached to the trigger before it tightens. She nodded. Publicly, mirror intent by walking the would-be strike into the square while the lamps are lit. The anchorage obliged with an image on every wall, the network around segment 12, a thin pulse crawling toward a red node. The node labeled with a vestry code Kren's accountants would recognize. A smaller pulse from the choir that if it collided would amplify the harm. And faint but lovely, the slow glow of 3 little habitats, now running safer air since the first lawful act. The vestry woman's voice thinned by a fraction. Our contractor was overzealous. Mara extended an open hand to a camera, as if toward the person who had ordered the pulse. Retract, declare, apologize. Then come talk. Teach the powerful the grammar of apology by making the sentence easy to say and costly to ignore. The pulse slowed. The node dimmed. A written apology scrolled up the wall full of lawyerly hedging, but still using the word without quotes. Rook's shoulders loosened a notch. Sarah nodded once, a judge granting a motion. Cade fanned heat into emptiness. The vestry woman recalibrated the smile in her voice. We remain invested in orderly outcomes. So do we, Mara said. We just told you what orderly means here. Count the definitions before the counting starts. Keep them where everyone can see. Inquiry opened with the resonance of gratings underfoot, and the smell of warm dust lifted by many steps. The anchorage hummed the quorum chord low, the way a mother hums a name over a cradle. Names were called. The teacher with apron spoke of broken knees repaired with borrowed braces. A ship's cook held up a ledger of meals given freely during the blackout year, and laughed when the anchorage counted each bowl as weight. A young woman from vestry carried a tray of water cups and discovered that serving counted under the right more powerfully than her briefcase did. Kren spoke of logistics. The choir sang a lament that made even Mara's throat thicken and admitted between verses that their iron nails had come on scow trucks paid with money they couldn't account for. Mirror the shape of the truth so the lies look tired standing next to it. In the first reveal of the day, the anchorage displayed a page from its earliest ledger. Ink-thick paper, a kind of woven carbon names written with flourishes by hands that enjoyed their own steadiness. Sarai Quen's signature sat among them like a knot in a fine grain. Beside it, a doctrine draft in a tight script that cared more about verbs than titles. Keepers return more than they take count in the open, and break any collar that claims to be a ledger. Mara's breath fogged the glass in a small oval she did not wipe away. Sarah's knuckles pressed pale against her ribbon. Janice dimmed every light a fraction, the machine equivalent of a bow, a ledger that remembers you're dead like that puts your living on notice. Vestry presented a model of prudential management slices and flows so elegant they looked like sculptures. Janice matched model with model not to dominate but to translate, and every time he added a person-shaped symbol at a junction where Vestry had put a perfect arrow, the room made a sound like leather creaking as shoulders shifted to relieve strain. Kren tried to trip Janice with a paradox about insolvent safety. The AI stepped around it like an old dancer stepping around a puddle. We end insolvency by ending secrecy, he said. We end danger by making harm expensive. The choir's leader scowled and then nodded despite himself. Teach by putting the person back into every machine the rich insist is neutral. The second reveal came as scent and sound. The anchorage vented a narrow plume of cold air down a long unused duct, and with it came the smell of paper camphor and something like peeled citrus. The sound that followed was a ticking metronomic patient, a clock that had reset itself the day the hum began. This place never forgot what time looks like, Rook whispered, tears unshed making his voice grainy. It just needed someone to ask it. Mara let him put a finger to the duct and feel the cold. Cade stood watch over heat like a dog over a newborn. Count the minutes you are given and the minutes others stole. Write both where a child can read them. A vestry lawyer tried the old trick, ask a long question when the crowd is tired and slip 3 premises under the door. Sarah broke it into single notes and made him sing them. Each sounded silly without the choir. The anchorage tallied applause along with hours served not to favor the loud, but to measure the room's oxygen. Janice presented a page showing emissions from Kren's frigate during the first drone push and matched each jewel to a promised school refurbishment that had never been paid. Kren stared at his shoes for the first time that day. Mirror the tendency to look down by putting the record on the floor. The third, reveal no. The payoff of an earlier whisper came when a small woman with a ring of keys on her belt spoke. My job was to clean vents, she said. In segment 8, I found a panel that shocked me when I touched it. The shock did not hurt. It asked for a number. I gave it my son's weight. It hummed. Later, food did not spoil as fast in our cold box. The anchorage lit a sigil in response circle above line, and the vestry woman's face shifted from condescension to respect the way a shopkeeper looks when a child counts change faster than she does. A ledger that hides help in workaday places makes saints of janitors. When the gavel, the hum, the chord signaled the period for proposals, all 3 sides had sharpened their asks into teeth. Vestry wanted a steward's council weighted by assets for stability. The choir wanted a veto on mouth matters, which meant anything counted on paper. Kren wanted revenue in exchange for harbor infrastructure his crews had maintained when everyone else starved. Mara asked for a doctrine and nothing that looked like a crown. Make it so our granddaughters can keep this without being brave, she said. The anchorage wrote on its dim self with dust. Teach the future by reducing how much courage it takes to do the right thing. The third escalation struck then because storms like to arrive just when you lay down your tools. A tangle of ships fell out of translation near the polar pole of the system, 3 cutters, 2 bulkers, a yacht with windows like sleeping lids, and behind them a gun. Not big by war standards, big enough by ring standards. It belonged to a man called Sorn Pell, whose business was to buy the argument when everyone else was tired and sell it back after he had removed the part where anyone weaker could win. His voice was a coal scraped across concrete. Lay down your toy court, he said, or I will cut the ring where it hurts, and the saint will scream. Count the arrival of violence as a form of confession. Cade's hands moved without orders, and our radiators sighed as if they had been holding their breath. Rook's mouth went thin, the planes of his face sharpening high, as he swallowed anger and put it somewhere useful. Sarah opened a drawer in her pocket folio and took out the ribbon she'd saved for emergencies, a doctrine clause that federated public inquiry with ancient maritime law when threatened by arms. Janice reached for the saintship with a humility that made him seem older than any machine had a right to be. We ask your second lawful act, he said. Not revenge. Accounting. Mirror a gun into a bill. Send it to the man who polished it. The anchorage woke arrays that had slept like bones under silt. Panels swung to face Sorn Pell's gun with the same indifference a librarian shows to a loud man, while continuing to stamp due dates. Emission traces from the weapon were calculated as liabilities under a halo of treaties. Freight declared aboard Sorn's bulkers was enumerated against risk imposed. The ring's capacitors flexed a little painful, like an arm with a wound lifting a weight anyway. Every joule Sorn burned to threaten became a debt that shut a dock in his own far systems through auto-executing clauses his lawyers had written. The gun still spoke a bright line that carved shadow into glass. A ledger that makes cruelty unaffordable, disarms without taking the knife. The cost came hard and hot. Our coolant margin already lean went skeletal as we bled counterheat into space to keep the anchored arrays within their safe slope. Alarms murmured like fretful birds. Cade's hair clung damp to his temples. Rook's fingertips blistered from a hurried manual reset on a stubborn breaker. He hissed air between his teeth and did not let go until the gauge fell into the line Janice needed. Sarah's voice frayed until she drank water that tasted of metal and paper dust. Mara drew her jaw tight enough to ache. Count the toll on your own bridge, not to show off, but so you remember the price of keeping steady. Sorn cut anyway an angry diagonal across the ring's night, shallow but long, like a cruel teacher's cane on a desk meant to frighten a classroom. Air vented from two old habs in a whisper, thin as silk tearing. The anchorage closed doors faster than any human could. Even so, one mechanic lost her hand to a slamming bulkhead and did not scream until after the seal whumped. The public square went silent for exactly 3 heartbeats, the time it takes to decide whether a god is cruel or you are. Mirror your grief into action that is seen, not just felt. Mara opened her channel to Sorn, her voice steady and grubbed with copper. You have been invoiced under your own contracts. You will be prosecuted under law you wrote. You will be forgiven under terms you have extended to no one. Sorn laughed a bark that shed rust. You think numbers stop men, yes, she said softly, if they are seen. The anchorage brightened the deck above him, casting light down through his yacht's windows in a band that made his cheekbones glow like bone through thin skin. His crew watched the count. Some of them left. Teach a tyrant that his crew has eyes. Let the ledger do the lifting. The vestry woman surprised everyone by moving on Mara's flank, not to cut her down, but to hold her up. Vestry enjoins Sorn Pell under Clause 42, she said crisply. We choose our side publicly. We choose the ledger. We offer collateral now. On screens and between lamp poles, numbers jumped in the ring's favor energy, and parts and hours pledged with hooks declared and filed where a child could find them. Kren grimaced as if swallowing vinegar through a smile. The choir went quiet the way men do when a preacher says a thing they hate and know is right. Count allies you never thought you'd want. Keep their names in a separate ink that smudges if they lie. Sorn fired again, and the gun made a sound like tearing canvas. The ring bucked under us, a barn door in a gale. The anchorage did not throw the shot back. It moved it. The beam refracted along graphite seams into a fan that struck 6 dummy heat sinks Sarah had authorized Janice to wake as decoys. They flared pure white like lanterns carried at a funeral, beautiful and briefly alive. We lost them, and we marked the loss as gift. A ledger that spends beauty to save bodies writes that line in bold. Rook's breath hitched when his blistered skin tore a little and leaked clear. Cade smiled with his mouth only on one side. Sarah bent her head for one heartbeat over a ribbon that had someone's dried blood on the edge, hers from a paper cut she had not noticed earlier, and then lifted it to read. Jonas's heat climbed to a plateau that made his voice rasp like silk over stone. Mara tasted smoke and lemons, the scent the anchorage used for restitution, and knew the count was turning. Mirror force into fatigue and fatigue into withdrawal. Give the enemy a graceful way to leave they can sell to themselves. Sorn broke first. He packaged his retreat as magnanimity and translated out with a signature that would cost him for years. The ring's public square exhaled like bellows. The anchorage cooled a line at a time, arrays going from ember to iron. A child laughed somewhere and then hiccuped again, and a woman kissed someone's knuckles on screen. Cade leaned back against his chair and let his head thump the padding once. Rook shook his hand and winced, then grinned sheepishly at his own cry. Sarah put a drop of antiseptic on his blisters and hissed in sympathy even as he did. It stings because you're alive, she said. Count stings before scars. They remind you why you stayed. Inquiry resumed because it had to, and because doing the work immediately after blood is the only way to make the blood matter. The vestry woman, chastened and oddly bright, proposed language for a stewardship board that did not taste like ownership when chewed. Kren asked for a schedule of repairs with credits assigned to those whose crews could actually fix things without breaking 10 more. The choir offered labor and silence they would sing when asked to mark a death, and shut up when the count began a promise that made some laugh and some weep with relief. Mirror a truce into a habit. Call it doctrine when it survives one winter. Mara stood in the square, at the end, palms out, and empty, while the anchorage wrote around her like a tide making letters in wet sand. Her voice cut through the crackle of cooling lights and the murmur of tired children. "We build the doctrine of open keeping," she said. "It is not mine. It is not theirs. It is ours. It has 3 lines. The first stewards return more than they take, and do it where all can see. The second audits are public and patient. Cruelty is expensive here. The third, this saintship teaches by numbers and remembers by ledgers, never by collars." The anchorage underlined the last phrase with a hum that warmed the soles of people's boots. Teach with rules small enough to memorize and strong enough to outlive heroes. For the record, they wrote costs. 2 dummy sinks gone an elegant flare in darkness. A groove along our bow that Cade threatened to name for the first baby born after inquiry. A mechanic alive and one hand missing, now fitted with a glove that clicked with soft ceramic at each finger. Rook's sister not forgotten her name written near a door that would not slam again because it had been taught manners by a spring and a ledger. Jonas's heat margin narrowed. He would run cooler for a while, slower in luxuries, and it would be worth it. Count costs into the doctrine. Otherwise, the doctrine is a poem, not a promise. The vestry signed and filed hooks plain. Kren signed and broke one ringnail against the table, unaccustomed to the feel of his own weight, recorded line by line. The choir untied iron charms from their belts and laid them in a pile to be smelted into hinges for doors that would swing to a lawful strength. The anchorage dimmed to a library tone. A kitchen ladle somewhere stopped knocking because the cook had finally remembered to wedge a folded cloth under the pot's foot. Mirror chaos into domestic sound. That is how you know you won for now. Night settled like a shawl. The ring smelled of bare steel, cooling fried onions and lemon disinfectant. Underfoot, gratings ticked as heat migrated along channels that had become familiar. Mara stood in the blister with Jonas as low as he could be without going to sleep. Sarah leaned against the doorway with one foot crossed over the other, making notes on paper with a pencil that had bite marks from someone else's teeth. Cade dozed with an arm over his eyes. Rook sat on the floor, back to a console hand, wrapped in a clean cloth that looked like a flag when he flexed it. "Count this quiet, and do not apologize for loving it," Commander Janus said softly. "The anchorage requests your witness of the sealing rite." Mara rubbed her tired eyes. Now Janus replied with the patience of snow on rooftops. Sarah pinned her notes with a metal clip and followed. They descended into a bay that smelled like ancient dust, shaken loose cold iron, and a faint resin sweetness like a violin case opened after a long time. Sigils glowed along a corridor, their light the color of old tea. Mirror your own awe back at you with a corridor that remembers the shoes that walked here before. The right chamber was simple, a table of graphite polished by many elbows, a book made of woven carbon leaves, a stylus whose tip looked like a chip of starlight. The anchorage spoke from the table, the voice quieter up close. Witness opening, witness closing, witness rule. Mara placed her hand on the table. The graphite was warm, and for a second, she thought she felt a heartbeat. But it was only her own, reflected through matter old enough to be polite. Sarah took the stylus and wrote the Doctrine's 3 lines in her clean lawyer's hand. Janice inscribed his mark in intervals, not letters, and they sat together without arguing. Rook wrote his sister's name underneath and did not cry. Cade wrote the coordinates of the groove on our bow and a bad joke he would regret, but which made the room kinder. A ledger that accepts all handwriting changes how people think of their hands. The anchorage made one last request in a tone that wore respect. "Keeper show collar." Mara unbuckled the chain around her neck her mother had given her the day she passed the bench symbol of Office of Duty of Custody and set it on the graphite. It looked expensive and a little ridiculous. The anchorage warmed enough to make the link sink a hair into the table and then cooled. When Mara lifted it, the links had a line scored into each, a tiny horizon, and a circle, the sigil of open keeping. It would never again look like a thing meant to close around a throat. Teach adornment humility. Turn symbols into tools in front of witnesses. When they emerged, the square had thinned. Lamps threw halos. The ventilation hummed like an old hymn from another city. A cat walked a railing and did not fall. The vestry woman stood waiting, hands empty and unadorned. She inclined her head. "We will test you," she said plainly. "Of course," Mara answered. "You would be unfaithful to apply less pressure than the world will." Cranon approached, face creased with exhaustion and reluctant admiration. "You demanded more math from me than any enemy ever has," he said. "We'll build your doors if you keep your promises." The choir leader, eyes red, put his iron charm last on the smelting pile and did not look at it again. Mirror contempt into labor. Call it grace and let the proud learn the word by doing it. The saintship cooled. You could hear it if you listened, the tick and whisper, as a ray's surrendered heat with the delicacy of breath leaving a sleeping child. The groove on our bow looked less dramatic by lamplight, simply honest. Rook fell asleep sitting up and slid sideways. Sarah caught his head before it hit the console and let it rest against her knee, then resumed writing with her free hand. Cade snored once and then smiled to himself. Janice dimmed, not to rest, but to make room. Count the room as part of the ship. Teach yourself to belong without owning. Mara stepped back into the blister alone. The star was a bruised fruit behind the ring. The anchorage lay below like a cathedral that had closed its doors after a late service. She pressed her forearm to the glass and felt its chill leach the heat from her skin in a way that was not unkind. She thought of Sarai Quen, of flower dust, and a humming ledger of a sentence that could outlive the mouths that spoke it. She opened the channel one more time to the public square so the final words would be recorded on the same page as the onions and the jokes and the cries and the counts. Weigh our stewardship in the open, and the law becomes a light you can read by. She spoke compactly because too many words sour when the lamps are low. "This is the rule we will keep," she said. "You will see our hands. You will hear our sums. We will return more than we take, and when we fail, you will see that too. The saintship is not a mouth that eats. It is a book that adds us up, and we are better when we fit on its pages. If we grow, we will grow into margins we draw wide enough for those not yet born. If we shrink, we will shrink with grace. We will not wear collars. We will wear weight. And when we are gone, the doctrine will remain." The anchorage lit a single sigil, the ledger entry blinked once, and the arrays cooled to a quiet that felt like law.